a mutilated corpse in a shallow grave. The victim's face, skinned, found in a young couple's fridge. Is this just another murder or a dark satanic ritual?
Hello people of the internet, and welcome back to episode 3 of Makeup Mayhem True Crime with Bella Monsoon. So here it is in a nutshell. I'm a mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with makeup and true crime, as well as the motives behind why people do what they do. So that means that every single True Crime Thursday, I post a new video which looks into the potential psychological motives behind true life crimes, as well as delving into why people do what they do, all whilst doing a bomb makeup look. So just a small disclaimer before I start this video. This video contains graphic descriptions, as well as contains some content that includes violence, self-harm and animal abuse. As with my other videos, I will add a timestamp on screen so that you can just fast forward past those sections. I would also like to add that I mean absolutely no disrespect to the family of the victim. The purpose of this video is purely for education and awareness of the horrific crime that was committed. This story has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes real-life accounts from individuals who were directly involved in this case, as well as images that have been taken from police record. So, without further ado, on to episode 3. So, everyone's had a fantasy at some stage, whether that is to become a rock star or just to wreak havoc on that horrible boss of yours. But for majority of the time, these fantasies, at least the negative ones, don't really work themselves into volition, and this is often for the better. Often though, with individuals such as serial killers and rapists, these fantasies become a blueprint for the crime that they want to commit. They spend hours, days, years thinking of the perfect scenario in their mind, and these fantasies can exist solely in their minds, or sometimes they will translate it into drawings, into art, or into written word. So for some, these fantasies can further isolate them from society, but for others who find someone who shares this fantasy, that can become their slice of heaven. So for two such young people living in the small mining town of Welkom, South Africa, their twisted fantasies led them to become a match made from hell. There are two individuals involved in the murder discussed in this episode. To begin, I will start by delving into the moments that led up to the murder that shook the country. Shanae was born into a tumultuous family life, as she was the third child of her mother Charmaine, and during this time her mother was actually planning to leave her father Jacques, but then she found out that she was pregnant. Charmaine then felt that she was forced to stay in this relationship, and for that reason, when Shanae was born, she struggled to form an attachment to her. She viewed Shanae as the child from a man that she no longer wanted to be with. She also apparently refused to hold her unborn child, and it was reported that Jacques was left to feed and bathe and console this crying infant. Eventually, 6 years down the line, they finally got divorced. After this point, her mother then dated a few different men, all of which whom were allegedly incredibly abusive and aggressive to both Charmaine and her children, who were living with her at the time. And one of the men even went as far as allegedly hitting Shanae with a cane until she bled. Around this point in time, Shanae's father, Jacques, then met a woman named Tanya, and they got married, and Shanae went to stay with them for a while. Shanae had a deep love for art and drawing and painting as she grew up. However, in her early childhood, her subject matter was quite dark, and she also claimed to speak to people who were not there. Whilst many children have an imaginary friend growing up, her family became quite concerned. One of the individuals, when questioned, that she said she spoke to was named Azazel. So it was this imaginary friend named Azazel that started to raise concerns for her family, in particular for her grandfather. So the name Azazel is actually the name of a goat demon or a fallen angel that is mentioned in the book of Enoch and in some ancient Jewish texts. So this might be quite strange for an 8-year-old to have found this name. However, it becomes less strange when understanding that her grandfather was actually a head pastor at a local church. And he actually brought her at the age of 8 to the front of the church in order to exorcise the demon that he thought possessed her. She remembers this experience as incredibly traumatizing, and she said from that day forward she never felt comfortable or safe in a church space. Growing up, she was also incredibly afraid of the dark, and her mother, in a bid to quell her fears, told her that her dolls used to come alive at night. I'm not sure how exactly that would help. Of course, this further traumatized her, and so every night before bed, she would tie her dolls up and she would tape their mouths shut. As she grew older, the instability of her childhood continued, and at the age of 10, she attempted to stab her stepmother, Tanya. She was then put onto mood stabilizing medication because she was thought to be depressed. However, she was not on that medication for very long. It was also during this time that she began to self-mutilate, and this would be an activity and a behavior that continued well into her adult years. Many children and adults who self-mutilate do it in order to find some emotional solace that they cannot find in the real world. In the next few years to follow, she began an activity with her father that would have a major impact in the crime that she later committed, and this activity was hunting. And when she went hunting with her father, it was her responsibility often to skin the buck and the hares that were caught. In her own account, she said that the initial moment of sliding the knife between the skin and tissue of an animal was the most fulfilling experience of her life. The only other thing she said later on that came close to that was when she self-mutilated and cut her arms and legs. She would then go on to take the frozen rats that they would feed to their pet snake, and she would skin these as well as dead animals that she would find. In essence, she became obsessed with the very act of skinning and just couldn't seem to get enough of it. So as she neared her teenage years, things became even more out of hand, and by the age of 12 she had fallen in with a bad crowd and she began using designer drugs such as ecstasy. So during one night, a man whom she considered an acquaintance and a friend took advantage of her altered state of mind and he raped her. She was a virgin at the time. She moved on from this incident without telling her parents, and she turned to her art as a way to express her pain. It is thought that only her sister had an idea of what happened at the time. So without counseling or justice for the rape that was committed, this experience just added to the trauma of her childhood. So when she was 15, her mother then moved to New Zealand with her new husband, and Shanae was left with her stepmother and her father. She had a really functional, good relationship with both of them, and they offered her support in any which way they could, hoping that she would grow out of this difficult phase. It was also during this time that she began to become really interested in the occult and paganism. So she then went on to become involved with a 22-year-old man who was a self-proclaimed Satanist. However, she says that she was never interested in the satanic parts of it that him and his friends engaged in, but she was rather interested in other parts of the occult, such as voodoo and Wicca. So at the age of 16, she then dropped out of school and she started studying art and design at a college. During this time, there was a marked change in her behavior as she stopped hanging around with a bad crowd. She was no longer with that boyfriend. She moved in with her sister, and she had even regained her blonde natural hair color. She excelled in her studies, she qualified, and she landed a job as a graphic designer. Her father at this point was incredibly proud of her, and he was relieved, thinking that everything had worked out for the best. So during this time, she also entered into a relationship with a man named Warren. To this day, Warren states that he had absolutely no idea of the kind of person that she was and what she was capable of, as during their relationship, she was incredibly sweet, and his parents and family even thought that she would be the perfect wife for him. After finding out about her crimes that she later committed, he posted quite a strongly worded message to his Facebook page. So Warren had a friend named Roy, and Roy would actually play an instrumental part in bringing these two future lovers together. Roy, from the moment that he met Shanae, said that he felt that there was something off about her. He claims that he could read people's energies, and that although everyone believed that she was incredibly sweet and nice, that he thought that there was something that just felt off. A few months into dating, and with no warning whatsoever, Shanae broke up with Warren, and they never saw each other again. However, at a party at Roy's house a few months earlier, Shanae had been introduced to a man by the name of Martens van Der Merwe, and little did she know then, but he would become her future lover and partner in crime. And so we will begin with his narrative. So Martens van Der Merwe was born and raised in Welkom, South Africa. He always felt that he was an outsider and cited his childhood being far from rainbows and butterflies, although it was a far cry from the childhood that Shanae had experienced. So he grew up with one brother, and although his parents divorced early on in life, he states that this had no real effect on him. He also went on to maintain a good relationship with both parents during this time. However, during his childhood, Martens was dealing with a mental illness that would continue to escalate until it made his life quite unbearable, and he had to seek help. It was at the age of 6 that he remembers experiencing his first visual and auditory hallucination. During this hallucination, a dragon-like creature appeared to him and told him that he was giving him the world as a gift, but that one day he would return to take it all back. Being a child and not really knowing what all of this meant, he felt that he was incredibly special and that he was chosen and destined for greatness. So as he grew up, he always tried to recreate the feeling that he had felt during his first hallucination. However, his hallucinations became worse and worse as he aged, and eventually at the age of 14 he was sent in to the psychiatrist and diagnosed with schizophrenia. Although a debilitating mental health disorder, with the correct medication and psychotherapy, schizophrenia can be treated and managed. His father, Francois, was incredibly committed to getting him help and ensuring that he received the best treatment possible, with reports even stating that he had spent his entire savings as well as his pension to ensure that Martens received the treatment that he needed. His mother, a principal at the local school and quite a well-known woman, however, did not accept this diagnosis as easily as his father did, and during this time and from this point on, she just seemed to distance herself a little from him in this aspect. So as he aged, he managed to get a grip on his schizophrenia with psychotherapy and medication. However, he ended up dropping out of school because the news of his diagnosis had spread through the community, and he was experiencing a lot of backlash, a lot of stigma, and a lot of bullying in school from his peers. However, his treatment of his schizophrenia was quite effective, with him only experiencing mild bouts of aggression every now and then. So during this point in time, his family lived on a small holding where they had quite a few dogs. From time to time, a stray cat would get into the property, and unfortunately the dogs would get to them. When this happened, it was Martens' duty to go and clean up. It was at this point that he began to become fascinated with these dead cats. He would even line up their bodies to observe the different stages of decomposition. He even stated that once a live cat got onto the property, and before even realizing what he was doing, he broke this cat's neck. So from this point on, the idea of death fascinated him. So because he had dropped out of school, he then went on to work in his father's carpentry business, and he later opened up his own furniture business, which he operated out of his father's workshop. So at this point in time, he felt as though he was doing extremely well, and so he decided to go off of his meds. So this is actually quite a common occurrence in not only schizophrenia patients, but in many patients who take chronic medication for mood disorders. So there are two main reasons for this. The first reason is that these chronic medications often come with side effects, which can be quite debilitating. In Martin's case, his side effects was weight gain, and he ended up becoming morbidly obese whilst he was using this medication. Another one, which is actually the most common one, is that as the medication begins to reach its optimum efficiency, it starts to balance the chemistry in the brain and the body, and this results in the individual feeling a balance and a homeostasis that has returned. It's at this point where they feel incredibly great, and they think that it'd be okay to just get off their meds now. So whilst it can work for some individuals, more often than not, it ends up in a downward spiral. So Martins at this point decided that he wanted more freedom, and so he opted to move in with his friend Roy, who I mentioned earlier. It was also at this point that Martins had lost over 60 kilograms and was feeling quite great. So remember I mentioned that Roy said he could read people's energies. So throughout this time, he never once picked up anything dark or disturbing about Martins' energies. So he claimed that Martins was a kind and caring person who would go out of their way to make those that he loved happy. Keep that in mind. So fast forward to another party at Roy's house shortly after Shanae and Warren had broken up. Martins and Shanae connected again, and from that moment they began speaking, and they ended up kissing at the end of the night, and they became infatuated with one another. So by December 2010, 20-year-old Shanae van Heerden and 24-year-old Martins van Der Merwe were texting each other daily. And so began the relationship that marked the beginning of the end. So over the next few minutes, I'll be sharing real text messages that were exchanged and sent from Shanae's phone. These messages were sent not only to Martins, but to her friends and family. So these two were actually incredibly happy with one another, and it appeared that they brought out the best in each other, with Shanae's father even referring to Martins as a polite and respectful young man. So the closer they became, the more time Shanae spent at Roy's house, much to his dismay. So he recalls one day whilst walking past the bathroom, noticing a long cut on Martins' chest. So he asked him what that was about. Martins simply answered that him and Shanae liked to try new things in the bedroom, and he was quite adamant to defend her. But soon enough, Martins began to distance himself from his friends and family. Shanae, on the other hand, continued to message her family. However, the messages were in stark contrast to one another. Her messages to Martins were more dark, and she called him her dark prince, whereas her messages to her friends and family were more light-hearted and bubbly. So as they got closer and closer, they realized that they both shared quite a lot of interests, because they both felt like outsiders as they grew up. They both self-mutilated, and they both had experimented with killing animals in their childhood. It was also at this point that they both started to seriously research different areas of the occult. So together they pulled different ideas from different religions and rituals, and they created a worldview or a world lens that they preferred. So one of the nights they even invited Roy to come with them. They went to the cemetery, and that was a place that was incredibly special and important in their rituals, and it was that evening that they exchanged rings that had serpents on them, and and they expressed their undying love for one another. So Shanae's interest was mainly in serial killers, and during this time she was watching a show called Dexter. So for those of you who are not aware, Dexter is an American television series about a blood splatter analyst who moonlights as a serial killer hunting down criminals. So it was also at this point that they began to call each other Dexter and Lumen. Lumen was a female character on the television show, and she started to hunt down and kill and exact her revenge on the men who raped her, and by the end of the season Dexter and her were almost partnered up and killing together. So their relationship spiraled out of control quite quickly, from a normal partnership to one in which they were creating an alternate reality in which they existed. They would later call this world Ashmore Valley. What they found in each other was a safe place where they were able to express their darkest desires and fantasies without judgment. So it was the beginning of February when they began searching for someone who, in their own words, they could release their darkness onto. So although the dark fantasies that Shanae and Martins had differed, fundamentally they were the same. Martins wanted to kill a human, and Shanae wanted to skin a human's face and sew their mouth shut. So it was at the beginning of March that they moved into a small flatlet in St. Helena, Welkom. So it is at this point I would like to just express a warning. There are descriptions and details of animal abuse and cruelty up ahead. As usual, I will include a timestamp on screen where you can forward to if you would prefer not to hear this. So also, with the fact that they had their own space now, they were able to start exacting and bringing their fantasies into reality. It was also at this point that they became increasingly more closed off to society, and it was around this time when Shanae's sister Liesl immigrated to New Zealand. So their first practice session began with 2 cats that they got at the pet shop. So they actually also filmed these, and Shanae is seen in her pajamas holding this kitten, whereas later this kitten was nailed to a cross and skinned. So whereas Shanae cut the head off of the one cat immediately, Martins was frantically stabbing the cat. So later she said that although the noises that the cat was making was upsetting and bothering her, she did not want to spoil the experience for Martins. So once they had dealt with the cats, they decided that they wanted to actually up the stakes, and they would get a dog from the SPCA. So Shanae later changed her mind because she decided that it would be incredibly cruel to bring an animal who was abused its whole life home to their house where it felt like it could have a future, only for them to kill it. And it's at this point where Michael van Eck enters the narrative. So Michael van Eck was a young man. He was 23 years old, and he was the only son with 3 sisters. He had studied and he was working in his first job as an electrician at the mines. He was also recovering from a breakup that had occurred around 6 months earlier, and he had been quite depressed during this time. However, he was incredibly well loved in the community, and everyone always said that he could be counted on to lend them a hand, that he was incredibly kind, and that he was incredibly loyal. In addition to this, he was also extremely into fitness, and he actually had a black belt in karate. It was on March 31st, 2011 when Shanae downloaded an app called To Go, and this is where she connected with Michael. She later would admit that it felt weird for her to be flirting with another man even though her boyfriend was sitting right next to her. This was the only thing that she found weird about that entire situation. So after speaking for a little bit, she suggested that they meet in the cemetery, as this would guarantee them alone time. So initially he was shocked by the suggestion, but the overall appeal of Shanae and her enthusiasm, I assume, kind of overruled his decision, and he agreed to meet. So as I mentioned before, the graveyard was incredibly symbolic for Shanae and Martins. This is where they had pledged their undying love to one another, and they believed that any person that they killed in this space, their soul would then go to their spirit world Ashmore Valley. So 2 days later, on the day of the murder, Shanae made a list of the items that she would need. These included surgical menorah blades, needles, black bags, wet wipes, a knife, rope, blankets, rocks, candles, and then she had a list of things that she needed to take with her, such as costume, gut, a box, a hammer, and another rope. She then picked an outfit to wear, and she ended up in a white dress, the same white dress that she had worn when they had killed the kittens. So they were scheduled to meet at 9 o'clock. Half an hour before they were scheduled to meet, she began to feel nervous. And the reason she was feeling nervous was not because she was about to kill someone. No, not that. She was nervous because she was scared of small talk. She was scared of making small talk with Michael because she didn't feel like she was good at it, and she felt like that would be quite an awkward thing to navigate. So over in Michael's house, he told his parents that he was going to pick up a girl in St. Helena and that they were going to the movies. When his mom said goodbye to him at the gate, she did notice that he turned the opposite direction of St. Helena, but she didn't think much of it, and she settled down for an evening with her husband. So Shanae and Martins had walked to the cemetery, and they had laid out the area. They laid out a white blanket, they had some glasses, and they had a bottle of wine. They had set up a date from hell. So they had agreed upon 9 p.m. as a meeting time. At 20 to 9, the records show that Shanae turned her phone off. At this point, she then went to go wait by the entrance of the cemetery. So I just like to issue another warning here. There is some violence mentioned in the descriptions I'm about to read. If you would prefer to skip it, I will of course add a timestamp on screen and you can just fast forward. So at 5 minutes to 9, Michael pulled up into the cemetery and Shanae met him by his car. So there's no way to know what crossed his mind during these moments, but Shanae led him to the picnic spot that she and Martins had laid out, and she was quite relieved when he took control of the situation as she poured them some wine. She soon, however, grew bored of conversation, and she gave the signal to Martins, which was leaning in to kiss Michael. At this moment, Martins popped out from behind Michael and he stabbed him in the back with a hunting knife. Michael, however, as I mentioned, was extremely into fitness. He had a black belt in karate and he just would not go down without a fight. So 29 stab wounds later, Michael was still fighting for his life, and it was at this point that Martins called Shanae to please help him. Shanae throughout all of this was by the building, by the Jewish section of the cemetery where they were, and she didn't really want to be a part of the actual killing and she was just keeping her distance. But at that point, she jumped in, she grabbed a hunting knife which was going to be used on the next part of their plan, and she stabbed Michael 3 times in the back. So these 3 stab wounds, in addition to the 29 stab wounds that Michael had already sustained, was the proverbial nail in the coffin. Michael fell to his knees and he said to Martins, "Just kill me." Just another trigger alert. The next descriptions are incredibly graphic, so if you once again want to skip ahead, I will add a timestamp on screen. So Martins then claims that he offered Michael the chance to say a prayer before slitting his throat. Once he was dead, they then dragged him back to this blanket and Shanae's part of the fantasy would begin. So they then removed his right arm and his right hand as well as his left foot. They then also decapitated him. During this time, they had to take turns cutting because they grew incredibly tired. At one stage, there was a car that pulled up into the cemetery. However, the occupant got out, shone a torch around, called out, but then eventually got back in the car and drove away. So once removed, these body parts were then placed into black bags that they had brought with them for the specific purpose. And then it was at this stage that they needed to dig a hole to bury the remaining body parts. So because they only had spoons to dig this hole was incredibly shallow, and they realized that in order to make the body fit, they would have to cut it into smaller pieces. After they had cut the body up into smaller pieces, they then set to cleaning the scene as best as they could, and they loaded the black bags with some of the body parts into the back of Michael's car. During this time, it is said that Martin's adrenaline was pumping, so he was actually unable to drive. So Shanae, although not having much experience with driving as well as not having a driving license, she drove them back home to their apartment. At their apartment, they dropped off the black bags with the body parts. Then they set off to take the vehicle to town near the taxi rank in the CBD, where they wanted to leave the car with the keys in the ignition in the hopes that someone would steal it. Once they had left the car there, they then set off on foot back home, where they slept until the next day. On Sunday, the 3rd of April, Ephraim Morolong was made aware of blood and a bloody rag in his cemetery by some of his workers, who were alarmed when they saw the blood splatter and the pools of blood. He immediately thought that he needed to call the police. An hour earlier, a call had been made about an abandoned Peugeot 207cc that had been left near a taxi rank in the CBD. A security guard had noticed the vehicle and called the police. The police then arrived on scene, they ran the number plates, and they got the registered address, which just so happened to be Michael van Eck's home. Michael's mom, Henriette, was incredibly confused to see them because she assumed that Michael had come home at some part in the evening and he had gone off to work. However, she went through, she checked his flatlet, and she noticed he was not there. It was at this point that she phoned his boss. So speaking to his boss, it had transpired that he was not at work, but his boss said that he remembers a conversation that he had with Michael about a girl that Michael was going to meet in the graveyard. He remembers telling Michael that he thought it was quite suspicious, and Michael had agreed. So the events that occurred next are almost surreal. It was at this point that Michael van Eck's family, his mother and his father, they set off to go and see this abandoned vehicle. So they went with the police. When they arrived on the scene, there was a one-legged drunk man who was attempting to steal the car. He was sitting in the car and trying to start it. At this point in time, Michael's father, Nas, he ran up to him and yanked him out of the vehicle, asking him, "Where's my son?" This man was then arrested and questioned by the police, and it transpired that he was just a simple thief who wanted to steal this vehicle to get home, where he said he would abandon it again. Like things couldn't get any weirder, Michael's sister and her husband arrived on the scene whilst this commotion was happening, and during this time, someone was trying to steal the bucky that Michael's mom and Michael's dad had arrived in. His sister was alerted to this, and she shouted that someone was trying to take their car. At this point in time, Henriette, Michael's mom, actually approached quite fearlessly the group of men who were trying to steal their bucky, and she managed to scare them off, with them citing something about getting into the wrong vehicle. So it was at this point that a missing persons case was then opened, and Henriette and her husband then decided that they would head to the graveyard because this is the last recorded place that Michael was supposed to be. His elder sister also accompanied them. So it was at this point in time when Ephraim was waiting at the cemetery for the police to arrive when Henriette and the family arrived first. She came rushing out of the vehicle, and she ran straight into the graveyard and became frantic when she saw the pools of blood. She ran over when she saw the rag lying on the ground and picked it up without even thinking. When she looked at it in her hand, she realized that it was not a rag, but it was instead a piece of her son's shirt. A piercing scream shattered the silence, and they went running around the graveyard in the hopes that they would find him injured but alive. Henriette even recalls pausing by the land by the Jewish section of the cemetery, almost as if she was drawn to that area. So it was then at this point when a search dog named Zander was brought into the scene. So after an initial sweep of the cemetery, he then alerted his handler to a section of the gravestones by the Jewish section. They found a torso missing a head. The jeans were still on the body, but the legs had been amputated below the knee. The left foot was missing, as well as the right arm and the right hand. Michael's dad had approached the scene, but the police had thought that it might be better if he was not on the scene. However, he had convinced them to let him see what had been discovered, and he later went on to identify his son's body by just a birthmark on one of the legs. His father then returned it to the family, but he did not make mention of the state of the body. It was shortly after this discovery that the investigating officer, Hendriana Nal, nicknamed Urgies, arrived on the scene. Hendriana Nal had over 20 years experience in the police force, as well as experience and training in the occult, and this would prove incredibly useful and applicable for the case that was to open. So the forensic team then removed the remains, and the police believed that this was a Muti murder. Detective Nal didn't feel as though this could be a Muti murder because the body still had the internal organs such as the lungs and the heart still intact. Michael's body was then sent for an autopsy, and it transpired that the doctor who performed the autopsy was actually the same doctor who had delivered Michael, and they saw that from the defensive wounds on the body that Michael had put up a great fight to his attack. Additionally, one of the neck vertebrae were missing, and this would never be found. The case actually proceeded quite quickly from here, with Detective Nal gaining access to Michael's cell phone records. She attempted to phone the last number dialed a couple of times, however that phone was still off. However, on the 5th of April she finally managed to get through, and a young girl answered. So Detective Nal decided she would use an old trick in the book that she learned from another colleague. And so she told this young girl that she was phoning from the Mediclinic, and that there was a woman who had listed her in her phone that had been in an accident and they needed to perform surgery. However, before they performed the surgery, they would need this girl to come in to identify her friend. A little while later, Shanae and Martins walked into the Mediclinic hand in hand into the sting operation that Detective Nal had set up. Detective Nal then approached the couple. She explained the situation, that there was no girl in an accident and that they were actually there to ask them questions about a murdered young man. The couple did not attempt to run, and Shanae simply said that she would tell Detective Nal everything she wanted to know. All she wanted was to speak alone with Martins for a few minutes. This request was of course denied, and they were arrested and put into separate police vehicles. It was at this point when Shanae directed Detective Nal and the police to her apartment that she shared with Martins, where things would become a lot more grim. So although clean, the police and Detective Nal reported that their apartment had an uneasy feeling about it. The walls were lined with images and drawings and paintings that Shanae had done, self-portraits of her looking like an alien, her without eyes, her with her mouth stitched closed. Shanae then, without saying anything, led Detective Nal to the fridge, and she pulled out 2 packs of frozen vegetables. She then removed what looked like a pizza base from the fridge. She set it down on the counter and she simply said, "His face." She unwrapped it. The eyelids were missing and the mouth had been sewn shut. She then reached in, she brought out 2 other containers. She put one on the counter saying his eyes, and she put the other one on the counter saying his ears. Lastly, she pointed to a container on top of the fridge labeled "the spawn of our prostitution," and in it was the money that they had taken off of Michael's body. That day he withdrew 1,000 rand from his first paycheck, and they had taken that money. So while they were looking at this container, Martins casually remarked that they had used some of the money to buy shovels for next time, as it was really difficult to dig with spoons. So in the flat, Michael's other possessions were found, along with journals of Shanae's with poems and writings in them, such as "I will rip off their faces to reveal the truth." She also had a journal that had an article that she had taken from the newspaper which had Michael's face on it, and she had written his information, that victim information, on there, like his name, his age, and his location, almost in a scrapbooking or memento sort of way. Tins then persisted with his arrogant attitude, even going so far as to tell the police officers that he thought they weren't doing such a great job because he wasn't being watched and he could have been tampering with the police scene. Later they went on to find the skull of a cat in a container in their bedroom. So Martins then led the police outside to the 3 black bags, including one bag which had the bodies of the cats in it. During this time, and whilst the crime scene was being photographed, Martins almost seemed to smile when he was included in these photos. So it was at this point when Sinead's father hastily arrived on scene after hearing from neighbors that the police were at his daughter's home. He then shouted at the police to release his daughter. Detective Nell walked on over to him and she explained what was going on, and he refused to believe it, so he walked up to Sinead and asked her if what Detective Nell was saying was true. It was at this point when she said to her father, "It's something I've wanted to do since I was 3 years old. I wanted to do it, I did it, and I would do it again." Her father was gobsmacked, as one would be, and he had no choice but to leave and let the detectives do what they needed to do. Before leaving the flat, Sinead grabbed 2 jackets, one for herself, one for Martins. Detective Nell didn't think much of it until later it transpired that they had sewn tablets into the lining of these jackets, and they had decided that if they were ever caught, they were going to commit suicide. However, Martins decided he was not going to go ahead with this plan, and so Sinead decided she would not either. Sinead then agreed to tell Detective Nell everything, but she told the police that she would not repeat herself and she was not there for the entertainment, so they needed to listen carefully. The couple were then booked and taken into custody. So that evening, Detective Nell experienced an extreme migraine, something that was really not common for her. However, after having a really rough night's sleep, she came back to the police station the next day and she noticed there were a bunch of police officers gathered around a cell where Sinead was being held. It was later discovered that Sinead had used an unknown instrument to cut into her thighs, and she was sitting on the bench in the holding cell with deep cuts in her thighs. In front of her there was a piece of bread that looked like it had a hair around it, and Detective Nell remembers thinking that that hair looked awfully like one of hers. On the wall behind Sinead, she had written in blood, "Along came a girl." She then looked up, she looked into Detective Nell's face, and she asked her,
"Did you sleep well, detective?"
So the story that Sinead told about the murder and about the days that led up to it almost felt as though she had read the story in a book. That Monday after the murder, Sinead had spent the day skinning Michael's face. She had even taken off work. As she retold the story, she was absolutely emotionless and expressed no regret whatsoever. She even mentioned that Martins had filmed them at a certain point. However, on the other side of it, Martins became way less arrogant when he was visited in the holding cells by his family, and he actually regressed to quite a childlike state when his mother came. His father also visited him in the cells and he prayed for him. It was shortly after this point when their trials began. So both Sinead and Martins were charged with murder, robbery, and mutilation of a corpse. There was an incredibly big emphasis on highlighting the potential and the propensity for these two to become serial killers should they be released. They were part of separate trials. Sinead's trial started first, while Martin's trial was delayed as he ended up being sent for 3 separate mental health evaluations. The last mental health evaluation deemed him mentally fit to stand trial, saying that his schizophrenia had played no role in him committing the murder. They assessed that he was not instructed by any audible or visual hallucination to commit the murder. It's really important to note here that mental illness is not just a reason to commit a crime. There has to be a tangible link shown between the mental illness and the murder in order to be able to plead insanity. Martins claimed to remember very little of the murder and at times displayed arrogance and aggression towards the prosecutor. He said he thought that by committing a murder he would learn something about life and death, but he said that the murder itself was unsatisfying. The letter was then read by Henriette, Michael's mom, from the perspective of it being written from Michael. It was at this point that Martins actually broke down and he did express regret for his part in the murder. So Professor Lowe, a forensic psychologist with many years of experience, said that due to the extremely rare nature of the crime, as well as comparing it to similar cases that had occurred worldwide, that Martins, in regards to his own actions and his own part in the crime, should be offered the chance of rehabilitation. So Martins read a statement that said, "Nothing I do or say can bring Michael back. I know it won't help to say I'm sorry, but I don't want you to fill your hearts with hate and anger and aggression and at the end of the day doom your own souls. I also don't want my actions to cause that. So for what it is worth, I am sorry." He was then sentenced to life plus 15 years. As he was walking down the passage to begin his sentence, Henriette, Michael's mom, reached out and hit him on the back of his head whilst swearing at him. So switching over to Shanae's trial, Shanae pled guilty on all 3 charges and she refused to be interviewed by forensic psychologists, stating that she was not their lab rat. She eventually agreed to speak to Professor, the forensic psychologist, after he told her that Martins would be there. The trial had begun in November of 2011 and she refused to take the stand and opted to have a statement read out for her. The statement was written in such a way to allude that they intended to rob Michael. However, it was later divulged by a social worker that Shanae had said, "I know I should feel guilty for what I did because everyone says I should. Everyone expects it from me. I try to feel guilt, but I can't." The only point where she showed any emotion during the trial was when at one stage she was seated next to Martins and he reached over and squeezed her hand and made eye contact with her. That was the last time that they ever saw each other. Shanae later admitted that the day after the murder they had actually become engaged and they had had the permission of her father. When they were together, it was like fuel and fire. So although there was a lot of outcry, especially in the small town at the time, there were actually no links to Satanism that could be proven. The rituals undertaken by the couple were mostly created by themselves and they drew from different religions to create their own world, Ashmore Valley, where they would be able to transport their spirits to and meet each other while they slept. Between her own admissions and the nature of the crime, the risk for her to relapse and kill again was assessed as being quite high. She even admitted that although they enjoyed it, they did not experience a high and they did not experience a satisfaction and were already brainstorming their next kill. So Professor Lowe believed that whilst Shanae had traits of both psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, he did not believe they were sufficient enough for her to be diagnosed. However, there was a little discrepancy between psychologists and psychiatrists and these beliefs because Gerard Labuschagne stated that she had been diagnosed with both and that the chance for her to be rehabilitated was extremely low. So for this reason and many more, the state wanted Shanae to be deemed a dangerous criminal. This would essentially mean that although she'd have a specific number of years on her sentence, she would not automatically be allowed to apply for parole or be released at the end of this time period. Essentially, this was a sentence without a definite end. When she was finally sentenced, she was sentenced to 25 years for the murder and 15 years for the robbery. These sentences were to be served concurrently. Because of her status as a dangerous criminal, she will then be required to appear back in court in 20 years' time, where the judge will then assess whether she is deemed fit for release. So ultimately, it was assessed that Shanae's psychopathic traits were more personality-based and thus fixed and unlikely to change, whereas Martin's psychopathic traits were more behavior-based, which offered the ability for rehabilitation to affect them. Important differentiation to be made, as it affected the propensity for future crimes. As mentioned, personality traits will most likely not change over time. However, behavioral traits can be affected by rehabilitation. Shanae was also the first female in South Africa to be classified as a dangerous criminal. When her sentence was read, she showed absolutely no emotion. The killer relationship between Martins and Shanae was mutualistic, which was quite different to majority of the serial killer and crime relationships that exist. For the two of them, they looked after one another and they gained strength from one another, as opposed to many of the parasitic killer relationships where there's always one dominant party. So whilst a mutualistic relationship is great for a modern normal relationship, it's not so great when it comes to killer couples. At this stage, you may be asking yourself, so where are they now? So Shanae and Martins continued to write each other up until 2014, when they decided to mutually end things, and Shanae cited that the reason was that they had grown and they had changed a lot. So currently she is serving her time in a female correctional service facility in Gauteng. She is studying theology and she teaches art to her fellow inmates. She is considered to be a model prisoner. So in 2017, Eric Holler, the owner of a website called Serial Killer Inc., reached out to her, and then he proceeded to share a drawing and a letter that she had written specifically for his site and for himself. So if you don't know what this guy does, he essentially reaches out to serial killers from around the world and he commissions artworks and drawings and writing and pretty much anything that you can imagine, and then he proceeds to list it on his site and sell it to people who are seriously obsessed with true crime and the dark nature of human behavior. So the letter that she had written to him included her favorite bands, her favorite movies and serial killers. It spoke about religion, her crimes, and even Martins. The drawing that she made for him was of a zombie-like female pulling her innards out. Eric Holler too believes that she was a serial killer in the making. So Martins is currently serving his time in a maximum security prison in the Free State. He has completed his matric certificate and plans to study further. So before we end this episode, I have a question for you, the viewer. Do you believe that there were connections to another world, to otherworldly forces that ultimately influenced Shanae and Martin's behavior and caused them in a way to do what they did? Or do you rather believe that their fantasy world took roots in reality, twisting the boundaries of fact and fiction? So we have come to the end of episode 3 of Makeup and Mayhem, True Crime with me, Bella Monsoon. Thank you for sticking around and watching today's episode. If you would like to see more true crime episodes and more makeup looks, then please don't forget to subscribe to my channel down below. If you enjoyed today's video, or if you found today's video interesting, insightful, or you enjoyed the makeup look, please remember to leave it a thumbs up. That really helps me out, like way more than you will ever believe, and it helps me out with the algorithm because I need the help. So until next time, if you just cannot wait until next True Crime Thursdays episode, then you can find me on my social media channels. Or else you can just leave me a comment down below. I do respond to those, so I am super keen to hear what you have to say. Until next time, my loves, stay awesome, stay safe, and stay blessed. Bye!
A body has been discovered!